Now we're going to talk about the kingdom fungi. This kingdom is also under the domain Eukarya. So as you can see on the image on the right, we're moving from the plant kingdom down to the kingdom fungi. So fungi are mushrooms, yeast, molds, you might see puffballs, all kinds of different types of mushrooms fall into this category. Now, mushrooms and other members of the kingdom fungi are not plants, right? They're their own kingdom. So they are not photosynthetic at all. So they cannot produce their own energy. But by the same token, you're looking at a fungus and you're going, well, it doesn't look like an animal. It doesn't have a mouth or a digestive tract. So how does it gain energy? So fungi, for the most part, are what we call decomposers. So they have digestive enzymes that they secrete onto dead organisms. So it could be the body of a dead mouse, or it could be a tree that has fallen in the woods, or it could be leaf material. Anything that has died, and in some cases it's also living organisms that they feed off of too. But for the most part, most fungi are going to be decomposers living off of dead organisms. And that's their crucial role in the ecosystem, is that they help to break down the bodies of these dead organisms and return those nutrients back to the environment. So they secrete these digestive enzymes, which breaks down the material outside of the body of the fungus, and then they absorb those nutrients. So it's a little bit like how a fly eats, right? A fly will secrete digestive enzymes to soften up its food so it can slurp it up. Fungi are a little bit like that. Well, they'll secrete the enzymes, and the enzymes will break everything down, and then they'll absorb it across their bodies. But they're important components of an ecosystem, all right? They are needed to help to break down these bodies and release the nitrogen and release the carbon and all those other elements back into the environment. And in the meantime, they're gaining energy from that food source. So let's look at the body of a fungus and what makes it different from the other organisms we've talked about. So fungi, when we look at what makes up their bodies and get down to the cellular level, we're looking at cells that have a cell wall. So we know that plants have cell wall and bacteria have cell walls. So that's kind of a common way to construct a cell, is to have that cell wall. We know in bacteria that the composition of the cell wall mainly consists of what we call peptidoglycan. And in plants, it's mainly composed of what we call cellulose, is found in their cell walls. So in fungi, they also have a type of molecule that's characteristic for them, and that it's called chitin. So chitin is found in their cell walls. So they're kind of plant-like in the fact that they have this cell wall, but it is different in which the main component of the cell wall is chitin. Now they also have more animal-like characteristics because they store their surplus energy as glycogen. So if you remember, glycogen was the carbohydrate that animals use to store their extra energy reserves. And in plants, it's usually starch. So for fungi, they use glycogen. So it's deemed like they have some characteristics that are a little bit like animals, some characteristics that are a little bit like plants. Now, for the body itself, right, we've got these cells that have cell walls. These cells can join end to end to form these very long filaments. And these filaments are what we call hyphae. So as it says, it's a network of these very fine, and they're colorless because they're usually underground. So the main body of a mushroom, let's say, is usually under the soil, like in the soil, under the ground. And you're not really seeing that mushroom until it pops up above ground with its fruiting structure. So the hyphae are these long filaments or threads that are in the soil, and they can be highly branched, and they're there basically absorbing nutrients from the soil. So the hyphae themselves can be, they can kind of look like one large cell, because sometimes the cells don't form walls between adjoining cells. So it could be one huge cell that has lots of nuclei, or they can be individual cells that do have cell walls between them to separate them. Now, when you take the hyphae and you consider the whole organism of the fungi, we call it the mycelium. So as it says, it's the entire bundle of hyphae, and that makes up the main body of the fungus. So hyphae are just refers to kind of those individual filaments, and then the entire body is referred to as the mycelium. And then what you see above ground is basically a fruiting body. So let's talk about reproduction here. So fungal reproduction can occur both asexually and sexually. So asexual reproduction, remember, does not involve two individuals. It just is reproduction of just one individual, and it's usually producing a clone or an exact replica of that individual. So asexual reproduction typically is through fragmentation, where a piece of the fungus just breaks off from the parent, and it can grow into an entire body of a new fungus. Okay, so very simple fragmentation, just break a piece off and it'll keep growing. Sexual reproduction is a little bit different from any organisms that we've talked about so far. There's not really a male or a female that is recognized in a fungus. Instead, we typically consider them to be what we call a positive and a negative strain. So there can be positive cells and negative cells. So these positive and negative cells combine together at some point to form the next generation. So typically when you see a mushroom body, right, that's when sexual reproduction is occurring. Okay, and that mushroom body will produce spores. So if you've ever taken the cap of a mushroom and you lay it on black paper and leave it there overnight, you'll get what's called a spore print. You can actually see in the morning all the spores will drop down onto the black paper, and you can see kind of the outline of the gills on the underside of a cap with all these spores that have been released. Okay, so usually the fruiting body is the mushroom that pops up above ground, and that's only when it's going through reproduction. And then it will release spores, and those spores a lot of times are spread by the wind to other areas where new mushrooms can then pop up. Now with mushrooms, or fungi I should say, there are what we call mycorrhizal associations. So fungi can actually help other organisms. So besides being decomposers, there's other roles that they can play. So many fungi assist plants by growing and intertwining and even growing within their root tissues. So the fungus can actually aid in the growth of the plant. So the fungus can help to absorb more water and nutrients for the plant tissues. So acting kind of like as the root system of the plant. So fungi a lot of times can grow much more quickly than a plant roots could and stretch out into new environments and absorb water and return that back to the plant tissues. So the plant is benefiting from having the fungus grow on or within its root system. And the fungus in return is basically living in a restaurant. It gets food delivered to it all the time. So the plant can provide sugar from photosynthesis, and it just sends that sugar down to the root system, and the fungus can then thrive off of the sugars that the plant provides. In the image, it's showing some marigolds. On the left is a plant that has no mycorrhizal associations, and the one on the right does have fungus growing within and or on its root system. So you can definitely see the difference in the growth of the plants. One is much more vigorous looking, produces a lot more flowers, looks healthier compared to the one on the left. And that simply has to do with that association with a fungus. And we call that a mycorrhizal association. And the last thing that I want to talk about are lichens. So lichens are their own organism. And a lichen, I say that they're their own organism, but they're really two organisms living together. So when you look at a lichen, the body of a lichen, we think of it as being one being, but it's actually two organisms living together, living very closely together. So it's what we call a mutualistic association. Mutualistic meaning that both members are benefiting from that association. So in the case of a lichen, it's a fungus that is growing with either a green alga or a cyanobacterium. So the fungus kind of makes up the main body of what you see of the lichen, and the algal partner or cyanobacterial partner is usually very small or tiny. So the fungus benefits from having a photosynthetic member. So it is an algae or a cyanobacteria, both of which are capable of photosynthesizing and producing food. So the fungus once again receives the food, and the fungus in turn kind of protects the alga from being dehydrated. It says in the notes there that it produces lichen acids that protect it from being eaten by predators. Although there are organisms that eat lichens, such as reindeers actually eat lichens. Some people believe that the fungus actually acts more as a parasite than a mutualistic association. So it's almost like the fungus is enslaving the alga, so that the alga is providing food for the fungus, but the fungus doesn't really provide anything in return for the alga. So there's different views on this type of association. But I wanted to make you aware that when you look at a lichen, and in the image that you're looking at, the orange flat structures growing on the rocks are the lichens, and a lot of times we see them growing on tree bark. They're kind of more of a pale green color, or kind of whitish in color sometimes. That those are lichens, and lichens are actually fungus and algae growing together. And one other thing that I want to point out about the fungi is in the D2L course site, there's some excellent articles about the fungi and the role that they play. There's one article that talks about how we use fungi, especially to produce different foods for us. One of the articles mentions, I think it's salami, where they just discovered a new fungus in salami, and how we use them to produce cheeses. And of course, people eat fungi directly. But it's kind of a very interesting article about humans and our relationship with fungi. So check that out.